Welcome to today's Explainer. We are jumping right into a really intense piece of economic analysis today. A recent source asks a deeply provocative, honestly kind of dramatic question about the future of one of the world's largest economies. We're going to break down this complex mix of global economics and historical parallels to see exactly what this source is arguing, and more importantly, why they are arguing it.
Okay, let's dive into this. The central question driving our entire analysis today is simple but massive. Is India actually heading towards a Sri Lanka-style economic crisis? Our source presents a pretty stark warning here, suggesting that recent public statements by the Prime Minister might actually be hinting at a severe impending financial disaster. It's a huge claim, right? So we're going to look closely at the data and the specific arguments presented to understand exactly how this alarming conclusion is being drawn.
To figure out the root of all this anxiety, we're turning to Section 1, an economic warning regarding public directives.
According to our source, during some recent election rallies, the Prime Minister laid out some, pretty unusual directives for the public. We're talking warnings to brace for impending petrol and fertilizer shortages, and a sudden push to immediately shift to organic farming. But the most demanding requests were that the public urgently reduce their daily petrol usage and, most shockingly to many folks, completely halt personal gold purchases for an entire year.
Think about the implications of those requests for a second. The source argues that if a government is suddenly asking 1.4 billion people to temporarily stop buying gold and to drastically cut back on petrol, it begs a massive question. Is a severe national bankruptcy looming? The critique here frames these requests not just as minor environmental tweaks, but as desperate measures that signal a much deeper, hidden financial fragility within the country.
To really grasp why critics are pointing to this potential fragility, we need to look backwards. This brings us to Section 2, historical oil prices, then versus now.
And this brilliantly illustrates the core of the economic frustration directed at the current administration. The source compares two very distinct political eras. Back during Dr. Manmohan Singh's tenure as Prime Minister, global crude oil was sitting at a staggering $140 per barrel, yet retail petrol was sold to the public at just 60 rupees a liter. Now contrast that with the current government's era. Crude oil has hovered around $100 to $110 per barrel, which is significantly lower, yet the retail price paid by the everyday citizen is much, much higher.
This glaring discrepancy leads directly to what the source focuses on as the missing margin. The speaker sharply questions where the financial margin went during all these recent years when crude oil was actually cheaper but retail prices stayed high. The argument is that this missing margin represents a fundamental failure of current economic management. The critics are essentially asking, hey, if the government pocketed that massive margin over the last several years, why is the country now in a position where citizens are being asked to make these extreme sacrifices? Because at the end of the day, paying higher prices at the pump, despite cheaper global oil, that hits the everyday citizen's wallet directly.
This intense economic debate inevitably leads us right into the realm of politics. Let's look at Section 3, the political blame game, and who is at fault.
We have a very clear breakdown of the opposing viewpoints here. On one side, the government's stance is that sudden international incidents and intense global market pressures are the primary causes of any impending domestic hardship. But the critics' stance, they are fiercely opposed to this explanation. They argue that a government that has been in power for over 12 years cannot simply keep blaming external factors. After more than a decade at the helm, critics argue the administration has to take full accountability for the state of the nation's economy.
To highlight this opposition, our source cites political figure Rahul Gandhi, who frames the situation precisely as a failure of leadership. He argues this is a failure of the government. A leader must have foresight and plan for the future. The core critique being presented by the source here is that true leadership involves anticipating these global shifts years in advance and planning accordingly. It's about not acting reactively and placing the entire burden of sacrifice on the shoulders of the citizens at the very last minute.
And it's exactly this fear regarding a lack of foresight that brings us to Section 4, the Sri Lanka parallel, which is presented as a major warning for India.
Let's move to and see how this builds, because the source explicitly maps out the exact sequence of events that led to Sri Lanka's total collapse, warning that India could literally be following these exact same steps. Watch this progression. Step 1. Domestic petrol prices rise unmanageably. Step 2. The national forex reserves completely deplete. Step 3. The nation is forced to take an emergency IMF loan just to survive. And finally, Step 4, complete political collapse, culminating in the Prime Minister, in Sri Lanka's case, Mahinda Rajapaksa, fleeing the country entirely.
The warning derived from this parallel is incredibly stark. The source argues that unchecked consumption of petrochemicals and gold today could force Indian leadership into a very similar collapse tomorrow. The speaker warns that if the public does not immediately get their consumption patterns under control, the current prime minister might eventually be forced into the exact same disastrous political and economic corner that we just witnessed in Sri Lanka. It's a heavy, heavy comparison.
Given this dire warning, what is the way out? Let's check out Section 5, Proposed Solutions and Pathways to Recovery.
The solutions outlined here demand heavy action on multiple fronts. For citizens, the source acknowledges that, whether they like it or not, they must endure 1 year of strict economic patience, radically reducing their reliance on petrol and gold just to help the country survive. However, there are also massive political and geopolitical solutions proposed. The source suggests that coalition parties might actually need to withdraw their support to force a change in government. A new government, they argue, could then rebuild collaborative relations with countries like Iran to secure much better oil deals and stabilize the whole economy.
So, the crucial point is this. Sacrifice absolutely cannot be a one-way street. The source emphatically states that 1.4 billion citizens cannot shoulder this immense economic burden all alone. Elected officials, whether we're talking about MLAs, MLCs, or the Prime Minister himself, they must also step up and sacrifice their own political privileges. The argument is that leadership simply cannot enjoy the perks of power while demanding that the public endures severe, life-altering economic hardship.
Which brings us to the ultimate question we want to leave you with today. Based on everything we've explored from this source, can collective citizen sacrifice actually prevent an economic downfall? Or does the ultimate responsibility lie squarely with the leadership and their capacity for long-term planning? It is a deeply complex debate about accountability, foresight, and the real true cost of global economic shifts. Thank you so much for joining me as we unpack this fascinating source material. Keep analyzing, keep asking those tough questions, and I will see you in our next explainer.